Hey everyone, this is Dean. Thanks so much for dropping by. Now today I've got another video for you in my composition series, and we're going to be talking foregrounds. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to run through some images with you and then explain the type of foreground that we should be placing into that image. Now foregrounds are really super important. I know years ago I never really used to worry too much about them or even think about them too much. I would just I'd be more concentrated on the subject, and you've got the subject but you're not really thinking about what you're putting underneath or including in that shot. Nowadays I work completely differently. I'm really focused on the foreground. And look, a lot of times I actually find the foreground first and then I make the image around it. So I've really learned a lot over the years, the impact that a foreground can have on an image. So that's what I want to share with you guys today. And I really hope you get a lot out of it, and it gives you some insight into how you should be treating these foregrounds when you're making your compositions. So speaking of composition, if this stuff really interests you and you're enjoying these videos, then keep an eye out because I'm bringing out a masterclass very soon. I'll leave a link in the description below, or you can jump on my newsletter and you'll find out about that there. When it comes out, it's going to be this type of stuff, but in a lot more depth and detail. So really looking forward to bringing that out for you guys. Okay, let's jump in and let's have a look at some foregrounds. Right, so what I'm going to do today is I'm going to break this up into two different styles of images just to try and simplify it a little bit. So the first type or style of image is where our subject is off in the distance, and this is a really common scenario, a common situation. It's probably the most common shot that we shoot. Now I'm also going to break it down into verticals and horizontals. So verticals like this one here, and then also horizontal images like this one. And the reason why I'm breaking it down into those two different types is that our approach and our foreground is going to be completely different. Now, the other style or type of image is the complete opposite. So this is where we're not being led to our subject. There's nothing in the distance. All of the important stuff is actually in the foreground or close to the camera. And again, I'll go through some vertical images like this one here, and also some horizontals, because again, our approach and our foreground is going to be completely different. Even if it's the same spot, the same place, we're still going to treat the foreground very different to a horizontal shot compared to a vertical shot. Righto, so let's get started with vertical images where we're being led into our subject. So let's have a look at this one. So this was shot in New Zealand last year. Beautiful area around Mount Cook. So my subject here is that mountain range, and it's absolutely spectacular, stunning. So we don't want a foreground that's going to compete with that. So the key thing here is to identify your subject. It's off in the distance. So we just want a foreground that's going to lead in and just push the viewer in. I always think of this style, this vertical style, when we're going to a subject off in the distance. I want a foreground to just push them in. Okay, I don't want them to be held in the foreground, because if you put a killer foreground in the front of this shot, then what's going to happen? They're going to go to the foreground and they're going to be wowed, and they're not going to head to the mountain range where you want them to go. So keep your foreground really subtle. Here's another one here. Same again, we've got this spectacular subject going off, off in the distance. So again, we just want to keep our foreground nice and clean, subtle, and not too distracting. I've also got some sneaky little lines going here. If you look at the immediate foreground there, I've sort of got a bit of a triangle pattern, and this is another thing that I sort of use a lot. So what that does is it just creates an angle that then again helps push into the subject. And when you look at this image, you're immediately attracted to the subject, and the light is hitting them, and you'll notice that the foreground is quite sort of plain and simple, almost sort of bland in a way, because that's just the stepping stone. It's a stepping stone into the image. Okay, let's look at one more vertical now. This one's getting a little bit more complex. So this is where our foreground is a little bit busier. It's a little bit harder to deal with, but you still can do it. So just keep that same thought process in your mind, that you don't want the foreground to be so good that we stop there. So in this situation, I couldn't find an area where it was really clean and sort of basic. It was all very, very busy and there was a lot going on. So what I've done here with this foreground is I've just tried to create some shapes and patterns and a little bit of texture in there. And then that way we sort of lead through that little windy bit into the, that apostle sitting right out in the ocean. So again, with this type of thing, it can get harder, and when your foreground is really busy, you've got to try and simplify it down. But just keep in mind that the key thing here is for the foreground not to overpower the background. Now, you're probably looking at this image here thinking, oh, hang on, here's one where we've got this absolute killer foreground and we're being led to a subject. So what's going on there? So let's have a little look at that one. So with this one, it's a little bit different, because what's happening here, and this is where you can break the rules a little bit and you can get away with it, is that our subject in the distance is very small. Okay, it's a lot smaller and it's not like really overpowering. So we're still being led to that, but it's not this great big mountain range or these three great big apostles. It's a small part. So when that's the case, you can put a more interesting foreground, and sometimes you have to. You've actually got to put more of an interesting foreground in to hold the image, because they're not being led to a wow spot. They're being led to a spot, but then what happens is the foreground becomes the journey to that spot. Now, the other thing is that with this image is that you'll notice that the foreground, it's very soft. Like, even though that is quite a powerful foreground, it's soft and it's not sort of overpowering. So we're being led to it, but we're not being hurled right in it. When I was shooting this one, when the waves weren't coming over and the reef was more exposed, those images just didn't work, because it was too much in the foreground, and sort of like then I was sort of being held in the foreground and not being led to the jetty. So again, you've got to really sort of read the image and try and get that foreground to work for it. Right, so let's look at a couple of horizontal images with our subject in the background. So this is that New Zealand shot. Well, it's not the same shot, it's the same mountain range shot on the same day, but a slightly different location. But when I shoot horizontal, it's a completely different, it's a different approach. I need to find a foreground that is basically, a lot of times I'm just looking to create a layer. I just want to layer across the immediate foreground to sort of step into that image. So again, I don't want to kill a foreground where they're going to stop there and not be led. So in this particular shot here, I have found these grasses which are very uniform in tone, you'll notice that. And from memory, it was pretty windy up on this little hill. So I've selected a slower shutter speed to sort of create a bit of blur through there. And then that becomes my first layer into the image. And this image is sort of layers in a way, because our midground is a layer. We've got a layer of mountain and then a layer of sky. The other thing, just to make a note on this one, when you look at this image, is, and this is very deliberate the way I've done this, to separate the foreground from that midground, is it's a completely different texture. Okay, it's similar in colour, but the texture is completely different. In the foreground, it's those grasses that are being blown and it's sort of all streaky going from the left to the right. And then the midground is more texture detail. So because those two are different, it's separating the immediate foreground from the midground. And I wanted that because I wanted the midground, I was really attracted by the rivers that ran through there. And I wanted that to sort of stand on its own as little sort of lines leading into the mountain. So again, you've got to, if you're going to have an immediate foreground in these wide shots, then you've sort of got to work hard on that being separated from your your midground. Okay, and I want to show you one more horizontal one, and this is like that vertical one where we can actually have a pretty good foreground, and this foreground is pretty strong. And again, I get away with it because we are leading into a subject that's very small in the frame. So it's not big, it's not big and dominant. So when that's the case, you can actually get away with a more interesting foreground, and you sort of need to have a more interesting foreground to make the picture sort of stand up. And then a couple of other things that are happening with this foreground and the way I have composed it is that it's sort of creating that V heading into the end of the jetty and where the light is in the sky. So again, you've got to think of your end point, and we're creating that foreground to push the viewer into the middle of that scene. So look, the key thing with these shots where we have our subject off in the distance is that we keep our foreground pretty subtle. We don't want to overpower it. We don't want the viewer to be held there. We want them to travel to that subject in the distance. So just keep that in mind. And then just remember those ones I showed you, that you can break the rules a little bit when you have a subject that is in the distance but very, very small. Then you actually need to incorporate a stronger foreground. Okay, so our other style of image was the complete opposite to this, where we're not being led into the distance. We are being held back in the foreground, and our subject is pretty much, most of these, the subject is going to be the foreground, or at least in the foreground. So let's have a look at some of those. So we'll start off with verticals. We've got one here. So it's pretty obvious. You can see what the subject is. It's this gold stripe that I found in this rock over in West Australia. I couldn't believe it when I stumbled across this. It was nowhere else along there. And then there's this great big bloody GT stripe, I call it. So I saw that, I had to make a picture of it. And this is the subject here. This is what I want the viewer to pulled into. This line going through this rock that's so extraordinary. So I don't want a background that's going to be distracting, and I don't want the rest of the foreground to be too distracting. So you've got to be mindful of how you place that in your frame and how much real estate you give it. So this one here, if we look at that rock area, it's probably about sort of 50%, maybe just a little bit over 50%. And for this style of image, you need to be giving your foregrounds at least 50%. So I go 50 to 70, and then the rest, the background and the sky, that just needs to be balanced out with the rest of the image. So you've got to give it plenty of dominance in the frame. Let's have a look at one more. So here again, we've got a really strong, powerful foreground. And you'll notice the background, there's really nothing there. We just led to the ocean and the sky. We don't even lead, well, no, we're not led to it because I want the viewer to stay in the foreground. So verticals are quite easy. When I say easy, they're easier than when you're shooting in horizontal mode. And the reason for that is that when you're in horizontal mode, we've got to deal with this much width and this much mess and clutter. And when you go vertical, you bring it down to this. So you're getting rid of all of that stuff on the side. So it's a lot easier to find a stronger part in your foreground. And this is a style, I shoot a lot of this stuff and I absolutely love it. I prefer to shoot this than something that's leading to a subject, because I find that a little bit cliched sometimes, where this is more, I think there's more vision with this sort of stuff. You've got to find it and then you've got to work it into a composition. So the main thing is that, as I said earlier, it's got to be strong, it's got to dominate. And the other things I look for is repetition. Tones that are sort of, tones and textures that are all the same. So you'll notice that, most of this rock in this foreground, it's all that one, those long sort of lines, and they also sort of lead the viewer through the image. This one I chose to put the grasses in the foreground. And the choice there was more to tell a story. This was shot on King Island, and King Island is like really, really rugged. It's probably the only other place I could say is as rugged as this is the Tarkine in Tasmania. And you just got a lot of this low sort of rocky, shelfy stuff that, it just tears your boots up. It's so incredible. So the idea of placing the little grasses in the foreground was just to sort of show that there is some life there as well. There's life, but it's so rugged. But this will work without the grass as well. The main thing is just to keep your foreground sort of fairly uniform. Righto, and one more vertical. So here again, if you look into the distance, there's nothing there, so it's all about the foreground. And again, here we are, probably about 70%, I reckon, foreground, sort of 30% sky and water. And it's all about the foreground, so you've got to find uniformity. This is the key to make these pictures work, is that there has to be some form of repetition in the foreground to sort of hold the viewer there, and that's what makes it interesting. So this one, there were all these sort of shapes of these rocks that were similar, and then there was these two lines that lead in, so they really sort of strengthen that composition as well. And lines coming out of your corners in this scenario work beautifully. And then also the cluster of rocks sort of out past the end of this group of rocks, they're not too busy and they just sort of sit there in the ocean. Really, we're drawn into this area in the middle here. And if you look at where that is in the frame, that's sort of in the center, so it's not the immediate foreground. I'm sort of using those lines to lead into that central part of the image. So again, the key thing here is that this foreground has to dominate. So we do that by giving it plenty of real estate and by keeping shapes and patterns nice and strong. So let's have a look now at some horizontal shots where it's sort of all about the foreground and there's nothing in the background. And look, my approach to these are very, very different to vertical shots of the same style. And you'll see that this is very, very different to that. So what happens with a vertical like this, if I'd shot that horizontal, then I'm going to lose a lot of the foreground for a start, and I'm going to have all the stuff on the sides. So then I'll lose the strength in the middle, and it just doesn't work. So when I shoot horizontal, I'm looking more for a big shape, something to sort of focus, something big. Quite often in reefs, I'm looking for rock pools. So I'm looking for that shape, and then I'm looking to make that shape really stand out, and that's what the picture's all about. So this one here, as you can see, obviously the main subject, what I want you to be drawn into is this rock pool in the middle where all this water comes in. Now with the verticals, I was shooting about 70%, remember? Okay, so your foreground, I was giving it 70%. In these, quite often I'm only around sort of halfway. I sort of keep that horizon line in the middle, and so it's sort of half foreground, half sky. And the reason why I do that is that if I put too much foreground in, then I'm going to lose that shape and it sort of doesn't work. There's too much of this reef. I just want this reef to create a shape around the pool, and I want the pool to be the subject, the key of the image where we're sort of led into. Now you'll also notice that in this foreground area here, this rocky area, it's very uniform. Okay, so you can notice that all those that pattern is sort of repeating itself through the foreground, and this is another really key thing that I look for, and this is what can really make this foreground work. And if you don't have it, then it can just make it look really busy and really cluttered, and it doesn't work. So you've got to look for that you've got to look for that uniformity, that pattern that's repeating itself in the landscape. And look, quite often it is there. You don't see it until you start looking for it. But it really, really does make a big difference with this style of image. It stops it looking cluttered. So let's have a look at another one, another horizontal. So this one's very different. This is a shelf. So this style works really well with rock ledges and shelves. So again, you've just got to find those areas of that shelf that are similar in texture and shape. Quite often it can create sort of patterns. We get these lines that intersect and make sections. I've composed this one to create this nice little shape down in the immediate foreground here. I sort of like that little curvy line through there. It just sort of breaks it up a little bit. And again, real estate wise, we're not going that sort of 70%, we're sort of bringing it back to a bit under halfway. This one's a little bit different because we've got this rock out on the right hand side, so I've sort of got a third there, a third sky, and then 2/3 water and foreground. Okay, and one more, last one. Let's have a look at this one. So again, we have got our subject, in the middle. Again, it's a rock pool that I sort of really want the viewer to lead into there because that's where all the action was happening. And with my foreground on this one, I didn't want too much, because if I had too much, then we would sort of be held on that ledge and looking at that ledge instead of just being pushed into the washing machine in the middle. And this is very important too, where you get that balance of how much you put in the immediate foreground. So with this one, my goal with the foreground was just to really make that shape stand out. And you can see the curve in that foreground. I've placed myself so as I'm creating that curve, and it's creating that shape in the middle. And there's not too much foreground to where it's sort of overpowering, because it's not about the rock ledge. The rock ledge is just there for the viewer to stand on to look at the actual subject. It's not actually the immediate foreground that is the subject. The subject is almost sort of the midground in this one. So that way you've got to treat your foreground accordingly. It's not key, so you don't give it too much real estate. It's just there to lead into that image. So thank you so much for watching. Don't forget, keep an eye out for that masterclass composition, Beyond the Basics. That'll be out in a month or so. Love to see you guys on that. You guys have a great day, and I'll catch you in the next one. See ya. Ciao.